Well, yesterday, toward the end of our session, we really just started on the topic of euthanasia. We were talking about some basic terminology, and we had said that there are three broad types of euthanasia. One is known as death with dignity circumstances or cases, another one, mercy killing, and then the final one we looked at was death selection or managerial euthanasia. Now, if you have had a chance to read the chapter, you know there's a lot of other distinctions. The discussion can be also framed so as, in regard to any of these things, especially the first two, death with dignity and mercy killing, you can talk about active or passive euthanasia. You can talk about direct, indirect. You can talk about voluntary, non-voluntary, involuntary. The list seems to go on indefinitely. And so I think it's good that we are familiar with that terminology. I trust that you've had a chance to read the chapter on euthanasia. And I thought what I would do initially this morning is simply pause long enough to ask you if, as you read the chapter, you had any questions about anything you saw there. Once you've raised those questions and I've responded, then I want to make sure that we emphasize certain things so that we're clear about them. I won't go over every argument that could be made for and against euthanasia, but that's basically how we want to proceed. So let me open it up to you. As you read the chapter, are there things that still need some explanation? At this point, we're just wanting to make sure that we understand concepts. Yes?
Yeah, I just had actually two questions, and both of them were with regards to withdrawing care of a terminally ill patient who's deemed medically futile in terms of actually helping or curing them. And it has more to do with the fine line between caring for the patient at some point with the medical technology and when the medical technology becomes not helpful but harmful. Because in every situation, in most situations, for instance, after 14 days on a ventilator, risk of ventilator-associated pneumonia goes up skyrockets, the risk of sepsis in an ICU skyrockets, every procedure that is done carries a certain risk, as well as pain to the patient, and can be harmful as opposed to helpful. And the first question would be, in terms of like a non-consequentialist ethic, all physicians are trained to operate under a non-maleficence and beneficence ethic, and first do no harm and then do good. How do you balance doing no harm to a patient who is terminally ill, futile, when all that the treatment, so-called, has become sort of more harmful or exclusively harmful in some situations, rather than helpful? And then the second question would be, from a consequentialist perspective, if you continue to administer such care to the patient, it becomes harmful. There are situations in which patients end up dying for reasons other than they were admitted, for actually the disease process itself. For instance, in a worst case scenario, a physician, actually a former colleague of mine, we had a patient who was a ward of the state, terminally ill, being medically futile, but the state commanded essentially that we continue all care, and in the midst of a very common procedure in the ICU, a complication happened, the patient died, and the nurses all blamed the physician for actually killing the patient, as opposed to the reason why the patient was admitted.
Okay, if I can stop you. Remembering that this is being streamed online and the people who are looking at this probably can't hear your questions. We should try to be a little bit more concise. But let me try to just summarize the nature of the question. The initial question is, in terms of end-of-life care, uh, regardless of what the care is, it could be some sort of technology, it could be some kind of surgical procedure, it could be some kind of medication. If the caregiving, if the procedure is futile, and not only is it not making the patient better, but it might be making the patient worse, would you, if you were a non-consequentialist, in your ethic, would you be morally obligated to continue it? Well, I would say a couple of things. I think, first of all, it becomes crucial to understand exactly what the technology is doing and what it isn't doing. It may be that the technology is nowhere near as harmful as the doctors are leading you to believe. It may be just that the disease is making its progress downward, and you're seeing the results of that. But if indeed there are procedures that are medically futile, then they surely are not accomplishing their intended goal, and they may be going against the intended goal, either the goal to preserve life or the goal to, in as much as is possible and morally permissible, to relieve pain. And there really are those two different goals that we're looking for. We're hoping to preserve life and not take life, but we're also hoping to cure pain. Now, those two goals don't have to conflict, but sometimes it seems that they do, or at least in the current debate, they are made to conflict because we're told that the only way to really release someone from pain is to end their life. But given those duties, I think regardless of whether one is a non-consequentialist or a consequentialist, the answer is that you are not morally obligated to undergo treatments that are medically futile or even harmful. And here again, remember the categories of morally obligatory and morally permissible. If someone says, well, here's a new surgery and it's rather experimental, and we don't know whether it'll do you much good. In fact, you might die on the operating table. But if you would like to give this a try, it may be the only possible thing that could help you. I think if the patient says, well, understanding all of that, I'm willing to take the risk because this may be the only possibility for some kind of help, then I think he is morally permitted to do that. I don't think he's morally required because there is so little guarantee of any kind of improvement, and it may be that it is futile. So, but definitely if the technology, if the medical procedures, the medications are not doing any good, and especially if they're making things worse, you're surely not morally obligated to continue them in order to be pro-life. Now, a consequentialist, it would be an easier decision. He's looking for the results of whatever you do, and since the results are either clearly negative or they are basically sort of unknown, but it's not clear that they would be good, well, then it seems that some might even argue that you are morally duty-bound not to continue with that. Because remember, with consequentialism, you calculate the consequences, and whatever action or actions produce the most positive benefit that you're looking for, well, the actions that would produce that become your moral obligation. So I guess I would say that in terms of medical futility. But now there was a second part to the question, I believe, or were those just some examples?
A non-consequentialist ethic for physicians physicians practicing under non-maleficence and beneficence.
Yeah.
How do you balance those principles when the treatment is deemed maleficent and non-beneficent?
Yeah. Then the question is, for someone who's non-consequentialist, and let's say some of the principles you're appealing to are that you act in ways that are beneficent, they're not maleficent or malfeasant, depending on how you want to pronounce that word. And you surely have the obligation to preserve life insofar as possible and not to take innocent life. What happens there? Well, here again, understanding the medical situation that you're dealing with is very, very important. And if it becomes clear that what you are doing or thinking of doing is not in fact helping, but it is putting the person's life at risk, then not because of the consequences, but because of the rule that we're not to take innocent life, et cetera, and that we are to do what we reasonably can do to reduce suffering. And if we know that the procedures we're using are increasing suffering, or at least they're not helping to relieve suffering, then I think one could make a case that it would be your duty to stop it. You surely would not be failing on some moral obligation that you had to the patient if you decided we're just not going to do this because I'm trying to obey rules not to take innocent life and to assuage suffering and to be compassionate, and I know that the course of action we're considering is going to be very, very different. So I will break those rules, then I shouldn't do that. Okay, great question. At this point, what I'm thinking, there surely is nothing wrong in asking about specific cases, what one might want to do. But at least initially, I just want to make sure that you understand the basic concepts that are presented in the chapter on euthanasia, and not just the concepts, but the arguments for and against them. So there was a lot of material there, I understand, and I'm just wondering if you have any questions of clarification about any of those concepts, any of those arguments. Yes?
Yeah, something in the chapter that struck me, I wanted to ask. You had said something about when you're looking at an advance directive,
Yes.
there's potential that, when the person gave that advance directive, that perhaps they weren't using proper decision making, so you shouldn't just look at the advance directive and see what the person needs to do. So maybe you could speak to, as a family, when you have an advance directive in front of you, or in the case where you think you know what the person, like they've actually said something, and you're in that decision making as a family, should you be thinking about, what do we think this person wants, or should you as a family be sitting down and saying, let's pray about this and look at it biblically and try to make that decision, even if it overrules what we might think that family member wanted?
Okay. Well, the first thing that I want to do is to repeat the question. It has to do with advance directives. And the question, of course, is are we obligated to follow those advance directives regardless of what they say? And what if we don't agree with them? And in fact, we're morally opposed to some of the things that it says. And maybe your whole family feels that way, or maybe it's some of you think this is not morally right, but others will say, well, whether it's right or wrong, it's the person's last wishes, and we need to follow whatever they want to do. There is a separate or distinct question about what sort of advance directive is the wisest way to go, and I intend to make sure we talk about that before we leave this subject, but that's part of the practical application material I want to talk about. However, and the reason that I mention that is the kind of advance directive that you have does make a difference. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, isn't there just one sort of thing and it's standard and everybody uses the same thing, a living will? And the answer to that is no. There are varieties of advance directives, and I want to talk with you before we leave this topic about the nature of each of these directives, what they do, what they don't do, what the misconceptions are about these things, because there are a lot of misconceptions, and to make a recommendation to you as to which of these would be the wisest way to go. But coming back just briefly and momentarily to the question that was asked, what do you do if the advance directive says some things that you ethically cannot agree with? Now, what's interesting here is that we have to distinguish between what we would want to say as ethicists from what we would have to say if we're interpreting the law, at least in America. Because as a result of the Patient Self-Determination Act that was passed several decades ago by the U.S. Congress, it was passed as part of a bigger bill. You know how Congress goes. They like to attach something controversial to things that are totally non-controversial. And if they can do that and keep people's focus away from the controversial stuff, well, then they can sneak some stuff by us. But at any rate, whether that was how this came to be or not, I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure. But I do know that basically what Congress was saying with the Patient Self-Determination Act is that decisions about your health care, your medical needs, are in your hands, more so than they're in the hands of the doctor. And that means you have a right to decide what kind of treatment you want and what kind of treatment you do not want. And as a result of that, there sprung up, if I can put it that way, almost overnight, a whole industry of lawyers and others who said, well, if we have a right to state what kind of treatment we want and that we don't want, we had better express that in some way, some written form, before we get to a point in life where we can't because we're in a coma or whatever, hence the living will industry. And elder law and all sorts of things going on in relation to that has become very, very big. And if somebody puts something in a living will, even if you do not like it, you don't have a legal recourse against it. Now, let me just step back for a moment and say, normally, you don't have a legal recourse against it. If the person who signed the living will tells you in private conversation that, well, he or she doesn't agree with everything in that document, most of it, yeah, would be okay, but if I ever get into circumstance X, I would prefer that you don't go through with this. Well, then if it comes time to execute the living will, you're going to see what's said there, and the medical profession will feel that that gives them permission to do whatever is stated in the living will. And in many cases, there isn't time for them to actually read the living will. So they basically think that if you sign one, that means you've given over decisions to the medical profession to do, you know, what they deem best. And of course, doctors and nurses are going to know what the contents of living wills are in general, and so they oftentimes interpret that as having been given carte blanche to do or say whatever they want. If you disagree with what's in a living will, normally you're not going to have a legal way to contest it. The open door, so to speak, or the crack to open the door to let you have a legal way is if in conversations after that living will was signed, or perhaps, well, it's better after, your relative, your friend, intimates to you that, well, I signed this living will and I'm comfortable with most of it, but there's one item here that I'm not really comfortable. If I get in that situation, I wouldn't want that part done. Well, then you could potentially go to court to keep that one thing from being implemented, but you're going to have some substantial evidence, more than just I had a conversation with this person on one occasion and they said they wouldn't want this. That's probably not going to cut it. You're going to need a good bit of anecdotal evidence. Here I'm thinking about the Terry Schiavo and also the Nancy Cruzan cases, where Nancy Cruzan was in a coma, basically a persistent vegetative state, for a long, long period of time. Her family, she was also being fed through a feeding tube, and her family, after a number of years, wanted that to be removed. They felt it wasn't helping her any, and it was just prolonging the misery. And so they went to the court and asked permission to remove it. And Nancy Cruzan had never signed a living will or any kind of advance directive. And so the judge, believing that anyone has the right to state their wishes, rejected the plea to stop the feeding, not because now he was saying, we're going to uphold life regardless of what you choose, but the issue in the Cruzan case was she never in any written form made it clear what her wishes would have been. And so since we don't know what she would have wanted to do, we can't do anything. Well, then the family goes back and they search for people who had conversations with her at one time or another in her life, and they brought back to the court data that showed that there were a number of people who had heard her say, if I'm ever in this sort of situation, remove the technology. I don't want to be kept alive that way. Hearing that information, the judge says, okay, you can go ahead and remove the feeding tube, or you can stop the feeding. And they did, and over a period of a couple of weeks or so, she then died. So legally is one thing. Morally is, in this case, not necessarily the same thing as legally. Because what someone may say in a living will or some other advance directive is, I would be willing to have you remove the technology. In other words, basically, I'd be willing to have you do things that would take my life. Either you withhold treatment that is working, or you don't start it in the first place. But the result is, at least the assumption is, I would die if this kind of care is not given. And if you and I see that and we say, but wait a minute, it's not morally permissible, acceptable to take innocent life, and the removal of this technology or the failure to use it in the first place is going to result in the taking of innocent life, then I can't agree with this. And you would then probably need to sit down with the rest of your family, maybe with the medical profession, I don't know, and talk this out. What you oftentimes see is that if you come at the issue from that perspective, you're clearly using a non-consequentialist ethical theory, and your family may come back with, but what quality of life is there? And it's not helping this person, and it's emotionally distressing for us to see our relative in this condition, and it is wasting financial resources from insurance companies, our family. It's an extra burden on the hospital. There are other patients who maybe need the room, need the treatment, and they could be helped, but that isn't happening. All of those considerations are consequentialist. We don't like the results of continuing his or her life, so let's put it to an end. So I think it becomes important, if you have disagreement, to share what your disagreements are ethically, and obviously those are going to stem from a certain ethical theory. You may not be able to convince your family members, even if you are in agreement, and even if you can convince them to your position, legally there may be nothing you can do. So you say, well, wow, then I guess no one should ever sign a living will. Well, I haven't said that, but what I do want to say and talk about in more detail is that there are different kinds of advance directives that can help you to get beyond some of these problems we've just been talking about. But that's what I would say as an initial response to that sort of scenario. Okay, other questions or comments about the basic concepts in the euthanasia debate that you've read about? Okay, well, if you don't have any others, let me at least move on and emphasize several things. And I don't want to go through every aspect of the argumentation. You've had a chance to read that. But I at least want to focus on some key items. And really, in the euthanasia debate, it centers around two major clusters of arguments. There are other arguments that are used too, but predominantly the discussion can be taken under one or two broad issues. And as noted here on the slide, the issues that are crucial, the huge cluster issues that are crucial in euthanasia, are the exact same ones that become crucial when the topic is abortion. On the one hand, there are the issues that relate to the personhood of the patient. Just as there is in the abortion debate, the argument to the effect that the developing baby in the womb does not qualify as a person, so it would be okay to abort that developing baby because you aren't doing anything immoral if you are removing something that is not a human person. Similarly, the argument goes, people at the other end of life who have a very decreased quality of life, and perhaps they're in a persistent vegetative state, or they go in and out of consciousness, or they are conscious but basically sit and stare at the room. They can't communicate with you. There are a lot of people who would say those folk don't qualify as persons. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, why does personhood make any difference or such a big difference? I thought the issue is this a human life? Well, there's not a huge amount of debate about whether someone who is either a developing embryo or at the other end of life on life support system, there's not a huge question about whether that person is human or whether they are alive. There are all sorts of signs of biological life. The question is, do they qualify as a person? You may say, but why? Why is personhood so good or so important to this issue? Well, I think the answer goes back, at least in part, within American law, to what happened with Roe v. Wade and the court decisions that followed it. made a centerpiece of the discussion whether the developing baby qualifies as a person, and if he is a person, then under the U.S. Constitution he has certain rights, and we have certain responsibilities to him. There are certain things that we can't do to him. If, on the other hand, he does not qualify as a person, then the Constitution doesn't guarantee any rights. And we do not have, as a society, as individual people, any responsibilities to that person. Same line of argument gets transferred to people at the other end of life. If they qualify as persons, then they have certain rights and there are responsibilities that you and I have to them. If they don't, then it's going to be hard under U.S. law to say if you remove this person from life support and they die, this is equivalent to murder, and you should be brought to trial, because normally you're not going to bring someone to trial who has killed a non-person or destroyed a non-person. I mean, for example, dirt clods, trees, etc., are not considered persons. So if you chop down a tree, if you destroy a building, if you smash dirt clods, you're not going to get hauled into court on a charge of murdering a person. Similarly, the argument goes, if the person at the tail end of life does not qualify as a person, then to stop his biological life is not to murder a person, and it would be morally acceptable. Now, obviously, for many of us, that sounds outrageous. But what I hope that you see is the only way this can even make the smallest amount of sense. We don't have to agree with this, but the only way it can even make the smallest amount of sense is if the people who are in favor of abortion and in favor of euthanasia have an idea of personhood that's probably different from the idea of personhood that you and I have. And we'll need to talk a little bit more about what that is. But is the developing baby, is the ill and infirm patient a person, or is he or she not? The second cluster of issues revolves around the question of freedom of choice. And basically, when the Supreme Court passed Roe v. Wade and subsequent rulings that relate to abortion, they gave to a woman the right to decide what to do with her own body. And what that basically meant is that you could not simply tell a woman, you're pregnant, so you have to allow that baby access to your body so it can develop and eventually be born. That abridges your freedom of choice of what you want to do with your body. And so in order to uphold your freedom of choice as to what you want to do with your body, we have to allow a woman who gets pregnant, regardless of the circumstances, we have to allow her to decide whether she wants to use her body for the next 9 months to carry that baby to term, or whether she wants to terminate the pregnancy. And since the value that is being upheld here is personal autonomy, to tell her you have to go through with this pregnancy is to abridge her freedom. And in American culture, of course, that's sort of the unforgivable sin. I mean, we all love freedom. We're Americans. the majority of us. And so the appeal is made, well, why, if you love freedom and are so determined that personal autonomy has to be the key to so many other things, why do you then restrict the personal autonomy and freedom of choice of the mother? Well, you can see where this is heading when it comes to euthanasia. You've got to respect the personal autonomy, the wishes of the patient. And that argument would be made in part because the Constitution, through the abortion discussions and decisions, has established that a woman has a right to privacy, a right to do with her own body what she wants. And in essence, those who are in favor of euthanasia say, similarly, anyone, man, woman, child, who is suffering greatly, maybe terminally, maybe not, but they have a right to do with their body what they want to do. And if they want to put their body to death, who is the government? Who is society to tell them that they can't do it? Now, freedom of choice in both of these debates is so elevated as the greatest value. If you were talking about a hierarchy of values, which would help you decide a hierarchy of moral rules that you can apply to a certain situation, for many people in our society, the supreme value, the supreme issue for them, if freedom of choice should ever conflict with some other valuable thing, like protecting innocent life, for them, the key value that sort of trumps everything else is going to be freedom of choice, personal autonomy. What that means, class, is that as you read the literature from secular writers, secular ethicists, it is almost impossible, if not totally impossible, to find someone who thinks that voluntary euthanasia in any form is morally wrong. Let me repeat that. Because freedom of choice is elevated as the supreme value, the supreme right that has to be protected no matter what else you want to preserve and protect, in the writings of secular ethicists, it is almost impossible to find someone who will say that voluntary euthanasia, which would then also include committing suicide, is morally wrong. We might frown upon it in general, but look, it was his choice. It's what she wanted to do. And so who are we to tell her that she can't do, that he can't do with his life what he wants? I mean, this is why someone like Jack Kevorkian, as outrageous as we think what he was doing is, there were a lot of people who were not only sort of sympathetic, they were fully behind him. And you are, of course, aware that the state of Oregon and the state of Washington have right to die laws, and at least within the last few years, another one was passed in the state of Montana. It was, last time I looked, still held up in the courts as to whether it was going to be constitutional, but probably, given what the Supreme Court has done in the Nancy Cruzan case and the Terry Schiavo case and others, really the Supreme Court has established that there is in the Constitution a right to die. And that means to die on your own terms and when and how you would like to do it. And so what's been happening in Oregon and Washington State and some of these other places, and has been attempted in California unsuccessfully on several occasions, By the way, don't assume that the pro-euthanasia forces are going to give up and just go away. They're going to continue to bring this up in one form or another. But those laws are playing upon the idea that freedom of choice is supreme, and if the person wants this, then who are we to tell them that they can't have it? Now, that's sort of the lay of the land, if you will, as to the two major clusters of arguments. Let me go back again to voluntary euthanasia. It is not just in secular ethics that you're going to be hard-pressed to find anyone to argue against voluntary euthanasia. You are even going to find some secular ethicists who will argue for involuntary or non-voluntary euthanasia. By the way, those last two are not the same thing. Non-voluntary euthanasia is when your life is taken, but you're not in a position to express whether you'd like that or not. Maybe you've never signed an advanced will, a living will, an advanced directive, or anything like that. You're then in a persistent vegetative state. You can't express your wishes, but your life is ended anyway. Involuntary, that's a case where you did, prior to getting into a end-of-life scenario, you did express your wishes and you explicitly said, I don't want to have my life taken if I'm in circumstance X, Y, and Z. And in spite of that, someone makes a decision to take your life. Well, a lot of secular ethicists would try to justify even involuntary and non-voluntary in some cases where they would argue it is to the benefit of the patient for us to end his life because he or she is in a persistent vegetative state right now. There's no hope of getting better. There's been severe brain damage, so even if they somehow or other woke up, they aren't going to be able to interact with their surroundings very well. And so it really, in terms of the principle of beneficence and patient benefit, we should help them out to end their life. Now, in those cases, secular ethicists will likely argue for non-voluntary and involuntary. But thankfully, most secular ethicists are not going to say, well, if the person is in relatively good health and they've never requested the right to die, it would be wrong then to put them to death. So secular ethicists totally in favor of voluntary euthanasia, and most of the time against involuntary. And probably most of the time against, or some of the time, at any rate, against non-voluntary. What about Christian ethicists? Well, you're not going to find Christian ethicists who favor involuntary euthanasia. Probably you're not going to find too many of them who favor even non-voluntary, although some would be, depending on the condition of the patient at that point, even if they hadn't expressed their wishes and they can't, I think some Christian ethicists and some Christians, looking at the situation and thinking about the consequences of continuing the person's life, might function as a consequentialist does without knowing that they're doing it, and say, you know, my cousin, my parent, whoever it is, never really expressed their wishes on this, but I'm sure they wouldn't want to be kept in this condition, and they know the Lord, and so why don't we release them? See, class, it's one thing to pray that the Lord will take a relative who is terminally ill, in great pain, etc., but then leave it in His hands to do so. in His timing and His way. It's another thing to say, well, from my perspective, if I were in that condition, the quality of life is pretty much non-existent. I'm a believer. I could be with the Lord. I would like to have this medical drama end. And I think there is an assumption that that's what most believers would want. And I think that there is also an assumption within Christian ethics and within a lot of people who sit in the pews next to us in our churches, that depending on the situation and the circumstances, if I'm in a persistent vegetative state, or even if I'm not, but there's been severe brain damage and there's little chance that I will recover much, if any, of my ability to interact with the environment. Well, given all of that and the fact that I'm a believer and I could be in the presence of the Lord if I were just allowed to die, yeah, if I decide to stop kidney dialysis, if I decide to give my approval to stop tube feedings or to remove respirators or whatever, and whether I do that in a living will or beforehand, or whether I do that when I'm in the midst of the crisis, if I can do that, well, then I think a lot of people in our churches should say, if that's Mom's last wish, I'd like to fulfill it. And why go on with this kind of life when she could be in the Lord's presence? So, what's the point I'm making? It would be easy, class, to say, oh, well, I know where that freedom of choice issue's coming from. That's coming from secular society. And secular society and American law have made a God out of freedom of choice. Anything is acceptable as long as I tell you go ahead. And it would be easy to think that we've got to oppose this, and no Christian could possibly even remotely think about going down that route because it would be usable to justify abortion, various points of euthanasia. But class, the fact of the matter is, we might say that in an intellectual discussion like this, but then when faced with a real live family situation, we have this desire to depart and be with Christ and not be a burden on our family emotionally, financially, or otherwise, etc., etc., etc. And we think it's wrong if someone ends our life or our relative's life when they don't say it's okay. But there are a lot of Christians who would say, well, if I'm ever on the machine, I wouldn't want that to happen, so I want to leave instructions, don't let that happen. And other Christians hear that and say, well, I don't know that I'd go that route, but it is their choice, and as long as they say so, that must mean it's okay. Can I give you an example there to protect the innocent, so to speak? I won't give the names. But there is a person whom I know quite well who was a very, very devout Christian. But by the time he came to the end of his life, he was suffering with all sorts of different diseases. And one of the things that had gone wrong required that he have dialysis, basically 3 times a week. And that became more and more and more of a chore. There were other diseases he had that were progressing, and he had fallen a number of times and broken bones in his body at one place or another. And it was at a point where there was hardly any position he could lie in a bed and not be in pain. And so this individual, though he was an evangelical Christian, no doubt saved, decided, I'm going to stop dialysis. And if you do that over the better part of 10 to 20, 25 days, you will wind up dying. And I think that you might say, well, that's kind of outrageous for him to do that. But I'm aware of the church that he was a member of, a rather influential one, a rather large one. Bible-believing, Bible-preaching, evangelical. I think the doctrinal statement of that church would probably be pretty close to the doctrinal statement of Master's Seminary and Grace Church. And I happened to be in that area at the time of his funeral. And for reasons that I'll share before we're done with this topic of euthanasia, I don't think foregoing kidney dialysis is a morally acceptable thing to do. And I thought that people at his church would feel the same way. Much to my surprise, went to the funeral, had some interaction with people there in the church, and it became very clear to me that the people in the church thought that what he had done was the right thing. It was a wise decision. And, you know, he's a believer. He wanted to be with the Lord. It's good that he did this. And no one put it this way, but of course the thought was, well, if that's his decision, then, you know, why not? What am I saying, class? What I'm saying is elevating freedom of choice is not just something, elevating freedom of choice to the supreme value, that is even more important than whether the person at the end of life qualifies as a person, is not just something that secular society and secular ethicists do. It's something that a lot of Christians, if they don't come out and boldly say it, they would approve by what they would do if they were in one of those end-of-life scenarios, and what they would agree with if a family member was in one of those end-of-life circumstances. Well, obviously, those of us who are Americans love freedom. We're not against freedom of choice in general, but it's not the only ethical and moral value. And principles about not abridging freedom are not the only ethical principles there are. There are also principles about not taking innocent human life. And then there's this whole discussion of whether this individual qualifies as a person or not. And if he is, then both under the U.S. Constitution, but surely regardless of the U.S. Constitution, this individual qualifies as a person, then you are taking innocent human life of someone who is a person. And there are a lot of us, thankfully, who think that those kinds of issues supersede upholding freedom of choice. But making it clear as to why freedom of choice is not the supreme value is not always easy. So whether you realize it or not, class, what I'm saying to you is something rather startling. There are a lot of people in your church, or your churches, who at least implicitly think that in certain situations, voluntary euthanasia is morally acceptable. In fact, there may be someone in this class this morning who agrees. Because you think under certain circumstances it would be okay to remove a feeding tube or stop feeding, or it would be okay to stop dialysis, or it would be okay even if the medical technology is not futile and it is sustaining life, but because things are not dramatically changing and this goes on and on and on for months and the like, it would be okay, some Christians would say, to remove the technology. Well, what about these issues, these clusters of issues? I want to at least say something a little bit further about the personhood question, and I've been debating exactly how far I should go into that. The case for people at the tail end of life qualifying as persons is the same kind of case that you would want to make in the abortion debate. But what first of all needs to be understood is that there are competing notions of personhood that are involved in both debates. They're the same different views in each case. But for example, those who favor abortion, those who would favor euthanasia, would be more inclined to have a social developmental notion of personhood. And according to that view, personhood is not an endowment that we get at conception. It is an achievement. So, not mere biological life qualifies, even if the biological individual is a human being, that doesn't qualify that individual to be a person. Something else must have happened and developed in order for that individual to qualify as a person. Now, the criteria of personhood vary from one author to the next when you're looking at people who hold this sociological, social, developmental view of personhood. But basically what all of these things amount to is that unless a person is able to perform various cognitive activities, such as being able to interact with other people cognitively, to be able to reason, not that you're, the greatest thinker ever, but that you have an ability to do that. These are things that no unborn baby is able to do. In fact, there are few, if any, babies through year one of their life who can do that. And surely people at the other end of life who have suffered dementia, suffered brain damage, are in a coma, are in a persistent vegetative state, they can't do any of those things, so they can't qualify as persons either. And as we said a few moments ago, if you don't qualify as a person. There are no rights that you have under U.S. law. And there are no responsibilities that society has to keep you alive, do whatever in its handling or treatment of you. That notion of personhood is very, very prevalent in our society today. And it usually goes with a discussion on what quality of life does the patient possess. Well, if he's in a coma, if he's hooked up to machines, if he can't interact with you, well, that's not much of a quality of life. If he can't do those sorts of things that qualify him or her to be a person, then they have a reduced quality of life. And those who favor euthanasia and also abortion, although the quality of life doesn't come up quite so frequently in the abortion discussion, they would say if the quality of life is minimal and the person cannot do these cognitive things that allow him or her to interact with their environment, well, then what's the point of continuing life? And on top of that, if they have ever expressed in some sort of advance directive that if they get into such a situation where the quality of life is meager, they don't want life to continue. So if technology is in place, remove it. If it hasn't been in place, withhold it. Or if no technology is involved, but they're suffering greatly and they can't bear the pain, do what you would with an animal that is in severe pain. Help them to relieve from that pain by ending their life. Because that may be the only way to get them out of pain. And it's not as though the treatment that they're getting is going to cure them. It's only prolonging the pain. And whereas there are pain drugs that do pretty well, in many cases there are some kinds of diseases that just don't seem to respond very well to pain medication of any sort. So you see how these personhood, quality of life, freedom of choice ideas get linked together to make what appears to be a very strong case in favor of euthanasia. Not necessarily the death selection, of course, because there's nothing physically and mentally wrong with these people, but death with dignity and mercy killing. You've been listening to the last 20 to 30 minutes, the line of argument, the main line of argument to say that this is morally okay. Well, in contrast to that, what would someone say who is against euthanasia? Well, when it comes to personhood, we shouldn't buy into the sociological developmental notion of personhood. We should believe that personhood, human personhood, is an endowment, not an achievement. But how would you tell on this alternative notion of personhood, how would you tell whether someone was a person or not, and how would you actually define personhood, if not in terms of developmental sociological terms? And incidentally, with this alternative notion of personhood, there is going to be a removal of the quality of life ethic criterion for whether life should be continued. And instead, There is going to be a sanctity of life ethic that tells us that this life needs to be preserved. And how does all of that fit with freedom of choice? Well, those of us who are pro-life, we're not saying that we're against freedom. We're just saying that sometimes there are values that supersede even freedom. And that freedom is not a paramount, universally the crucial issue that is more important than anything else. And if I can put it most fundamentally, because Scripture says it is not morally permissible to take innocent life, that's true whether it's someone else's innocent life or it's yours. So, if the question is it all right to kill me if I give you permission? Say, what an outrageous question. Class, that's the heart of the voluntary euthanasia debate. There are a lot of people who think as long as I give you permission to give me a lethal injection, to take me off the respirator or whatever, then it's morally okay for you to go ahead and do that. I've done nothing immoral and you've done nothing immoral if you agree to do what I've expressed as my wishes. But class, surely freedom of choice is not going to be the paramount thing. And perhaps even more fundamentally, freedom of choice cannot turn a morally evil activity into a morally good activity. Let me repeat that and illustrate it. Freedom of choice cannot turn a morally evil action into a morally good one. Now you may think, how is that even relevant? Well, it's right at the heart of this. If it is morally wrong to take innocent life, I can't make the taking of innocent life morally acceptable by giving permission to take that innocent life. That's the ultimate point that I'm trying to make, but let me illustrate it further. Suppose on a given day you go to the shopping mall, and as you're there are a lot of men, a lot of women, and in particular there's a lot of attractive women that you see. And let's say there's one of those women who's especially attractive and she's married and you're married, but for whatever the reasons are, you are attracted to her, and you know, though you are probably not going to go through with it, you're thinking of committing adultery. Now, all of us, I'm sure, would say it's not right for someone married to one person to have sex relations with someone married to someone else, or not married to anybody. But now think about this. Suppose your wife found out about this and said, you know, honey, I think it might strengthen our marriage if you had some other experiences from time to time. So don't make this a habit, but you've got my permission to have sex with this other woman. And suppose it turns out that this other woman's husband says the same thing to her. Does the act of adultery become morally acceptable because the parties involved gave their permission? They chose to go ahead and do this and to encourage this man and this woman to do? Of course not. Of course not. Something that is immoral does not become moral by giving permission to do it. And that's true whether it is adultery, murder, taking the life of someone in the womb or at the other end of their life. If it is innocent life, it doesn't become acceptable to take it because they've given permission at one or another times in their life. And so, what I'm saying is the issue of personhood, I think, is more important, and sanctity of life is more important than quality of life, and all of that more important than upholding freedom of choice. Well, all right, what is the notion of personhood, though, that we're talking about? If not a sociological developmental one, then what? Well, I think a different notion of personhood is necessary. In the earlier edition of our ethics text, we argued for a biological, genetic concept of personhood, namely that whoever has the genetic makeup of a human being qualifies as a human person. That's something that you can tell from the moment of conception to the moment, well, and even after, they die. Now, how can that happen from the moment of conception? At the moment of conception, the DNA strands are species specific. What that means is, at the moment of conception, if you were to test this and you looked at the DNA strands of this fertilized egg, you could tell this was going to develop into a human being, not a bird, not a fish, not a cow. And we know genetically, biologically, that same genetic code the person has throughout their same life, their whole life. But what I came to see as I was working on the revision of this text is that what we had done in the first edition of the book is to argue for a genetic biological view of personhood, and kind of left it in those terms. I think that was good to do. But I realized that what we really need is two things here. We need a criterion for personhood, and we need a test for personhood. Now, what's a criterion? A criterion is a standard that has to be met in order for something to qualify as an instance of whatever. So, what we're saying is, if someone is going to qualify as a human person, there must be something that is true of them. And of course, we've got to define what that criterion, what that standard is. But then, once we know what characteristic or quality makes someone a human person, then we need to have some way of testing to see if they meet that criterion, right? And I think that's something that had been left out of the first edition. And putting it this way now, what you have seen if you've read the chapters on abortion is that this issue of personhood gets a good bit more coverage than it did in the first edition of the book, because I'm stating a criterion of personhood, and I realize that it's controversial, so I've constructed an argument to support this criterion, and then I've talked about a way to test it. Now, the other view of personhood the same requirement is there. They have their criterion. Their criterion focuses on various cognitive activities that the person can do. They also have a way of testing. Go and have a conversation with the person. See if they can reason. See if they can respond to stimuli. See if they can initiate things on their own. So the other side has to give a criterion and have a test too, and they do. Well, here's where I'm a bit hesitant as to how much further to go on this, because this could really get us into a lengthy discussion. Let me just share some of the basics with you and encourage you to read the first chapter, especially on abortion, where we talk about this whole issue of personhood. We're still referring to this alternate notion of personhood that's pro-life as a genetic, biological view, but now we're saying here's the criterion to use for personhood. And the criterion is that anyone who is, or if you prefer the terminology, is made in the image of God is a human person. Now, a couple of things need to happen then. If that's the criterion, I need to explain and defend it, because on the surface of it, the non-believer isn't going to have any clue as to why being the image of God should make anyone qualify as a person. And there may even be believers who aren't sure why that's the thing that you chose from every biblical concept and made it the criterion. Just as an aside class, let me just say this. You might be thinking, oh, well, this will really appeal to those of us who are believers, but no non-believer's going to buy it. Well, possibly so, but don't let that make you back down. Why? Well, people who hold the social developmental view of personhood, they have their criterion, they have their views, and they stem from their worldview, and they're not hesitant to state those. And by the way, they need to prove that their criterion is correct, just as we need to prove that ours is correct. So if the other side is willing to boldly and blatantly say, here's what we think it is, and here's why we think it's right, you and I should not be apologetic about saying, here's what we make as our criterion, and yeah, it's based on the Bible. And yes, I understand you're going to want me to defend that, and I'm willing to, but turnabout is fair play. You need to tell me your criterion, your notion of personhood, and you need to defend that as the right one, and the worldview out of which that criterion comes, you've got to defend that too. So I think so many times we hear people in our society say, well, why do you think this, that, or the other? And we say, well, because the Bible says. And they say, oh, okay, yeah, the Bible. But, why should we pay any attention to that? They won't even listen to it. Well, ask them to give you the same courtesy that you give to them when they tell you what they believe and the basis of that. Which in some cases turns out to be hilarious. But don't tell them that. We don't want to offend them needlessly. Okay, so the criterion. Well, obviously you're going to need a defense, and what I've done in the chapter is to write a 4-step argument, and let me just share it with you. But I won't go into all the details of defending it. I just would encourage you to look at that. You say, well, wait a minute. This is in the discussion of abortion, and this is going to be stated in terms that are relevant to abortion. Why are you presenting this here? Well, because the same thing is at issue. The only difference is the stage of development of the individual. It's not whether there's one criterion for personhood for someone in the womb and then another one when they get out of the womb and yet another one when they get to the other end of life. No, it's the same criterion, and it should be the same test. It surely is for those who favor euthanasia. The criterion is certain cognitive abilities, and the test is go and try to have a conversation with them. And you'll see whether they can do those cognitive things. Okay, let me at least share the argument with you, and perhaps in the process say a little bit about the defense of it, but refer you to the place in the first chapter on abortion where we cover this. It's a 4-step argument. Step 1 says if X is an embryo, and for euthanasia just substitute if X is an adult at the end of life, made from human sperm and egg, then X is a human being. Now notice I have italicized being. That was on purpose. I'm not saying at this point that we've got a human person. What we're saying is we've got some sort of entity once you have a fertilized egg, and it is a human entity. We don't yet know whether it's a person. All right, well, the defense of this is the easiest. If this embryo is made from human sperm and human egg, how could it be anything but a human being? I mean, is it going to be a cow or a fish? If you have any doubts about that, by the way, check the DNA strands. They're species specific at the moment of conception. And you can do the same thing at the other end of life. Just because someone is suffering from dementia or they're in a persistent vegetative state, that doesn't mean if you did a DNA test, you'd find that now you're dealing with a fish. No, it's still a human thing. Okay, step 2. If I can get this to respond, there we go. If X is a human being, then X is or is made in the image of God. Okay, this is obviously a much more controversial claim to make. Here, obviously, we are appealing to something in Scripture. But as I said a few moments ago, don't be bashful about doing that. Yes, you may have to do an apologetic as to why Scripture and anything that it says has to be believed or should be believed, but that's okay. Make your friend, your pro-euthanasia friend, defend why he thinks that reason is an acceptable source, because that's where he probably got his criterion of personhood. Now, you may say, well, I'm not a skeptic on appealing to something scriptural, so I'm okay with that, but there's a lot of stuff in Scripture. Why did you choose this? Was it sort of ad hoc? Was it convenient? No, there's a specific reason for it. As you read Scripture, especially as you start out the Bible in Genesis, but isn't the only place, you have the creation of all of the creatures, including man. And what is interesting is that human beings are the only creatures that are ever referred to as the image of God. That's never said of animals. It is never said about angels. It is chosen then because it is a characteristic that is distinctly reserved in Scripture for humans and for humans alone. Now that doesn't mean we've proved personhood yet. We haven't. Okay. Step 3. If X is or is made in the image of God, then X is a human person. Now we're getting the controversial idea in here, personhood. Let me just give you very briefly the flavor of this defense, the defense for this premise in the argument. Well, it goes like this, basically. To say that someone is the image of something else means, at very least, that it shares some characteristics that are analogous to characteristics of the thing of which it's an image. I think I said that right. If something is the image of something else, it means at very least that it has some characteristics that are analogous to characteristics of the thing of which it is an image. So, if we are the image of God, some of the things that are true of Him should be true of us. One of them is not that we are divine. That's an attribute that He has that we don't. So, you can be the image of someone without being identical. But now, what is God like? Well, God thinks, God makes decisions, God acts, God speaks, things of that sort. Are those things that human beings can do? Yeah. But aren't those also things that we would point to, thinking, willing, acting, etc.? Aren't those the kind of things that would be pointed to, and I'm not talking about Scripture necessarily here, but even a secular philosopher talking about action would, and personhood would probably say, well, if something can think and can reason and can will and can talk and can act, that sounds like a person. Well, we know God does all of those things, and human beings do all of those things too. So if we're the image of God and God is a person, the kind of things He does that would make us say He's a person, we know we do those things too. So we should qualify as a person, it seems. Well, therefore, if X is a human being, then X is a human person. We started out by proving that X is a human being because it is a distinct entity made from male sperm and female egg. What could it be but human? We then said that if X is human, it's the image of God. If X is the image of God, then it's a person. So, if X is a human being, X is a human person. Now, a lot of the support for the earlier steps, especially step 2 and 3, appeal not to Scripture, but to biology. And I would encourage you to read the discussion of that in the chapter on abortion, because there are certain facts that are true biologically and genetically of an embryo that are true of a human being for the whole life. Doesn't change by getting born, by becoming an adolescent, by becoming an adult, by growing old, and ultimately dying. So, the criterion we're using is being the image of God, supported by this 4-step argument. What's the test? all right, if that's the criterion and this is how you support that criterion as the right one, then how do I know in any specific instance whether I'm dealing with a human person or a human non-person? Here's where we get to the test, and the test is genetics and biology. If you're wondering if this person in the persistent vegetative state has ceased to be a human being and person, etc., do a DNA test. The strands are species specific at the moment of conception, and that never changes throughout their whole life. So that's the basic line of argument for personhood from conception to the end of life, and it's usable both in the abortion debate and in the euthanasia debate. And if we have a human person, then we've got the image of God, and that should suggest that this life has a certain sanctity to it, regardless of what its quality might be. Okay, let me stop and take some questions here. Yes?
I have a question on the four-step argument in between the first and second arguments. When you were described, just for some clarification.
First and second step, you mean?
The second and third step, actually.
Okay.
When you were describing how if human beings are made in the image of God, and God, and I think you said that because he thinks, he makes decisions, he acts.
Right.
That the God is, because of those things, God is a person.
Right.
Then maybe the other side might say, well, when the human ceases to think, act, and make decisions, then that reflection has ceased as well.
Okay, good question. The question is about the move in this argument from step 2 to step 3. And in showing that humans are the image of God, or excuse me, human beings are human persons, we were saying that to be the image of God means that some things that are true of God are also true of us. And it turns out that the things that we can point to that are similarities are just precisely the kind of things that would cause someone to say, well, I'm dealing with a person. Now the question is, that makes sense, but the other side might say, well, when this individual stops making that, stops being able to do those sorts of things, thinking, reasoning, acting, etc., then they stop being the image of God, or they stop being a person. So how would one respond to that? Well, there is a distinction that is made, because this sort of thing does come up in the abortion discussion. The question here is, well, look, you know, the embryo during the first 9 months, and actually more than just the embryo, for the first few years of life, the baby can't do the things that God can do. So can't we make the same objection at the front end of life? And here there are some things I think to say, and let me just find this one point that I want to make and refer you to it. The gentleman who I'm relying on heavily in the discussion on personhood for the biology and genetics is a man by the name of Patrick Lee. And what he talks about is that there are actually two different kinds of capacities or potentialities for higher mental functions. The first kind is an immediately or almost immediately exercisable ability to engage in higher mental functions. The second one is a basic natural capacity to develop oneself to the point where one does perform such actions. And pro-choice people would demand that you have the first kind of ability, that you're immediately able to interact. Pro-life folk would say, no, it's acceptable only to have the capacity to develop oneself to that point. And then Lee goes into a thorough discussion of why the latter should be acceptable. Now, I realize it's a little bit different at the other end of life, because if the person is in the persistent vegetative state, it's not likely they're going to be developing this. But I think what we can say here is that this person who's in this state has given ample evidence throughout their life up to that point that they had that capacity, not only to develop, but they immediately had it. And as long as they've had it at any point, and the same DNA structures are still there, how can you say they're disqualified because something has happened to their physical or their medical condition that makes it difficult for them to use these capacities we know they had? And here again, I think the biology and the genetics come in. That the test for whether this is a human being, human person, can still be performed at that end of life. And the DNA strands still show you that despite what's happened medically, this is a human being. It's not a cow or a fish or a bird. Now, I think the case is easier to make at the front end of life because you know that there is going to be that possibility to show development in the future. But it seems that if possibility to show development in the future is acceptable as a way to say this should be respected as a human person and given rights, it's a little bit hard for me to see why, having had and exercised those abilities, would not still qualify someone as a person, even as those abilities diminish and have diminished. You see, it's just one stage of development or another, and you surely wouldn't conclude that because the person has suffered from dementia, because the person is unconscious and has brain damage, this is no longer a human being. The genetic test will convince you that it is, but then think of step two. If X is a human being and the person in the persistent vegetative state still is a human being, then X is the image of God. Now we know God's never going to lose any of his capacity, so obviously we're talking analogy, not identity. But there's nothing that would suggest that when someone gets to that tail end of their life, they stop being the image of God. They are no longer as capable of demonstrating some of the things that we would say comprise the image. But it's hard to see when biologically, genetically, it's the same organism. If at one point in its existence it qualified as the image of God because a human being, why would it not qualify as a human being and image of God later on? So, I mean, realize that what we're talking about applies to people all through their life. Are you going to say that someone, let's say, who has Down syndrome and a fairly severe case of it, they're not in PVS, persistent vegetative state, they're not in a coma, but they surely have developed capacities beyond what they were in the womb, but they're never going to be what you and I have as capacities. But why does a greater quantity of a capacity turn out to be the defining characteristic for what makes someone a person? And by the way, class, that's exactly what the other side is arguing. Remember, they're saying personhood is not an endowment, it's an achievement, which means not just having brain power, but having developed it to a certain point. And if we say, well, because this person with Down syndrome can't develop it to a certain point, or the person in the PVS has gone beyond that point of development, we've left the image of God criterion and we bought into the developmental criterion that we're trying to refute. And I do believe that the two criteria are not identical. They surely come from very different worldviews. Yes?
We should be getting there soon, but will the criteria for death help identify what we're talking about in terms of personhood and when someone stops being a person?
Very good question. The question is, when we talk about criteria for physical death, will that be relevant, excuse me, to this discussion of who qualifies as a person and when they do or when they don't? And I would say the answer is no, because I think we're confusing two issues. The issues of who qualifies as a person is different from the issue of who qualifies as alive. John Calvin, Martin Luther, any number of people are no longer alive. Does that make you think of them as non-persons? No. Similarly, someone who's gone through a stage of development in their life where they're past their greatest powers and their powers have begun to decline. Do you think of them just because they're aging as no longer a person? I think that the question you're asking is extremely important. And the importance of it is to underscore the fact that there is a difference between criteria of physical death, which is an important question, and a separate question, criteria of who qualifies as a person. Great question. Others? Yes. I should let you have.
Just thinking about artificial intelligence, kind of not getting too science fiction oriented for those that aren't aware of things like the Terminator, but
Right.
what do you see the implication of how much, like in regards to the quality of human life, and when you get to the point where somebody could potentially have part of their body, lost in some horrific accident, and artificial intelligence allows something to be done to allow them to continue to live in some functionality. The debate of which they're more artificial than they are human, and and what allows them to continue to function like somebody living on a machine. It's just as technology increases,
Sure.
and there's the opportunity to help people continue to live through an artificial intelligence source. That kind of gets sticky. It seems to a personhood issue.
Okay, the question is, how does all of this relate to artificial intelligence and the potential application of that to someone who's been injured, lost some well, for example, if someone lost a leg, you could give them an artificial leg and they could still function. What about with artificial intelligence? I think it's not, at least in my thinking, enough, and this may just mean that I don't know enough about the technology, but I think that there's a world of difference between hooking up an artificial leg to someone who's lost a leg as opposed to, I don't even know what this means, hooking up an artificial brain to someone who's lost the ability to be conscious. I don't even know whether that works. But the other point I would make is that neither of these concepts of personhood says that there won't be any instances where it's really hard to figure out whether you are actually dealing with a person or not. We grant there will be hard cases. And if artificial intelligence could be at some point hooked up to help someone who can't think, then I think we would have to look at it and say, well, does that qualify as a person anymore, or just what? But that's not the normal way we encounter people, and so I think that what we're talking about in this part of the discussion is not every possible scenario, but the usual ones. What we would say about artificial intelligence, I think it would be hard to say, if you said that the human it was hooked up to is still a person, I think you'd have to say he's a person in virtue of the DNA strands, not in virtue of the computer or the technology, because that stuff isn't the image of God. It's the human being, which we verify is still there by the DNA test. That's the image of God. So, yeah, I think that is something, though, that one would have to think about a little bit further, should that kind of technology come into being. And, of course, one of the questions that would be interesting to wrestle with, and I don't know as a theologian exactly what you would say, is if you have to hook up artificial intelligence to get any kind of interaction intellectually with the person, what does that mean about the soul? Has it left the body? Are we dealing with more of a robot now than a human being? I don't know how you go about answering, theologically speaking and biblically speaking, those kinds of questions. Okay, another question or two, and then we should take a break.
I have a question regarding freedom of choice issues.
You bet.
And I want to kind of back up from kind of like even the start of that regarding technology. Is it immoral for a person to reject technology as a whole?
I'm inclined, let me repeat the question first. In terms of freedom of choice issues, the question is it immoral for someone to reject technology as a whole? And I'm guessing you mean medical technology that relates to a person's continuation of life, not just technology that would allow us to communicate through cell phones, things like that. We're talking about a specific kind of technology. Here, I would be inclined to say, I don't think you can make a generalization that talks about all of the technology, because there would be individual cases where using the technology would be futile, and so of course it would not be immoral to reject it then. But if using the technology would be beneficial, it could accomplish some things, I think then that's where it becomes a bit difficult. I would say, since we have a duty to preserve life and not to take a life, and by omitting the use of the technology, we are sort of passively doing euthanasia. That we're we're sort of passively committing suicide, if I could put it that way, well, it's not morally acceptable to take innocent life, including our own, so that if there is technology that would keep us alive, might even cure us, I think that more often than not, we would be morally obligated to use it. But I don't want to say that every end-of-life scenario would be such that you'd always have to use it. We can imagine cases where it would be futile. We can imagine cases where it wouldn't be futile, but the person maybe is going to die within hours anyway, so you might say, what's the point? On the other side of it, I've had some people say, well, but why remove the technology, or why not? If they're going to die in a few hours, what's the harm? I mean, if the technology would make them a little more comfortable, it's not going to make it impossible for them to die, but it'll make them more comfortable. Well, what's the harm in using it? So you can make a case either way in that kind of scenario. So I wouldn't be inclined to say, in general, it's wrong to reject technology or it's right to reject it. It's obligatory to invoke technology or it's obligatory not to. The most you can say will be to give a few cases where you've nuanced the situation, that it's not just, well, in general. And then you say, in those cases, no, it wouldn't be wrong to reject technology, or yes, it would be. But to make one general rule that covers every case, I think the situations are too complicated to do that. Okay? Yes. There's one more.
Following off of the question in the back, if personhood is determined by specific strand DNA testing, then at which point does that human being cease being a person? You mentioned Martin Luther and John Calvin,
Sure.
But according to just even the legal system determining personhood, would it have to be when that corpse is completely, gone, or there's no DNA left to test?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, let me first of all remember to repeat the question. The question about DNA being tested or testable, or personhood being testable through DNA testing or establishable, at what point does an individual then cease to be a person? Is it at the point that there's no more DNA to test, or just when is that going to be? Here I think you begin to get into matters that are theological as to what happens to an individual at physical death. We know that the immaterial part goes into the presence of the Lord if they're a believer. If they're a non-believer, they go into torment. The material part of their being goes into the ground. One of the questions that is debatable and debated among philosophers who talk about, and I think also theologians who talk about personhood, is the following question: is a disembodied soul a person, a human person at any rate, or do you need to have an embodied soul for it to be a human being, let alone a human person? Those are not easy questions to resolve. We're not likely to do that here. But my inclination is to say that this individual is always to be thought of as a person. It's just that there's going to come a point in time when we're not going to be able to perform a test to demonstrate that that's so. But that doesn't mean that they never were a person or that this is a wrong criterion. Any more than the fact that when someone dies, if you're working with the social developmental notion of personhood, you can no longer have the conversation with that person. Does that mean they never were a person? So I think the question that you're asking is an important one, but I tend to see it as relating a little bit more to how long is personhood testable in the ways that we're talking about. And not so much how long or at what point does someone stop being a person. I think if you're a person, you never stop being a person, but you're in a different stage of existence. And if it turns out that being a human person means that you've got an embodied soul, well, then that adds another dimension to it. After a person dies physically, I suppose theologically we'd have to say they're not, for a period of their existence until the resurrection, they're not a person, and then they are a person, a glorified human person. But at that point, I guess the question would be, we can have that kind of discussion, we can add that, but I don't think it helps us answer the question that we are most interested in ethics and in theology of human nature. Namely, we're asking questions about, in our non-glorified bodies, in our natural state, who qualifies as a person and who doesn't, and how do you know? Once you leave natural existence, well, then the discussion can go in a very different direction, but it's not going to be all that helpful to us one way or another in terms of the things we need to decide from an ethical standpoint.